The winter of 1878 came down on the Gray River settlement like a hammer. It was not a slow, creeping cold, but a sudden, violent assault that seemed to have a personal malice. The wind, born in the vast, empty plains to the north, traveled for 1,000 miles with nothing to break its stride, and it struck the thin pine walls of the settlers' cabins like a battering ram. It was a cold that didn't just steal the warmth from a room. It stole the breath from your lungs and the hope from your heart. The very air grew thin and sharp, turning each inhalation into a painful reminder of the world's hostility. The settlers were not new to hardship. They were a hardy stock, drawn to the promise of free land and a life carved from their own grit. But this cold was different. It was a living entity, a predator that hunted them in their own homes. They burned wood with a desperate, furious pace, stuffing their cast-iron stoves until they glowed a menacing cherry red. Yet 10 feet from the fire, the cold held its ground. Frost bloomed on the inside of the walls, delicate, deadly flowers of ice that grew thicker by the day. Water left in a bucket by the door would be a solid block by morning. The sound of the settlement was the constant, rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood, a frantic heartbeat against the overwhelming silence of the snow. They did what they had always done. They chinked the gaps between the logs with mud and moss, a futile gesture against a wind that seeped through the very grain of the wood. They hung heavy animal hides over the doors and windows, only to watch them stiffen with frost and sway like boards in the drafts. The Miller family lost their entire flock of chickens in a single night, frozen solid on their roosts inside a barn that was meant to protect them. The Jensens' youngest son coughed, a dry, rattling cough that echoed the sound of the wind in their chimney, a sound that struck more fear into his parents' hearts than any blizzard. The problem was universal, a shared misery that bound the community in a fragile solidarity. Their cabins, built with pride and sweat according to the time-honored methods they had been taught, were failing them. They were tall, handsome structures of notched logs, symbols of their conquest over the wilderness. But in the face of this particular winter, they were nothing more than wooden cages, offering the illusion of shelter, while the true enemy, the cold itself, walked freely within their walls. They were all fighting the same losing battle, burning through their precious woodpiles, watching their children grow pale, and praying for a spring that seemed a lifetime away. They were trapped by their own knowledge, unable to conceive of a solution beyond doing the same thing, only harder. Into this landscape of shared desperation walked Ilara. She was 14, but the years had already carved their lines around her eyes, giving her the solemn, watchful gaze of someone much older. She was an outsider in the truest sense, having arrived at the edge of the settlement in late summer with nothing but a canvas sack and the clothes on her back. Her stepfather, a man with a temper as bitter as the winter wind, had cast her out after her mother's passing. He had given her a small portion of bread, a worn blanket, and pointed her down the road. "The world has no room for another mouth that doesn't need to feed," he had said, and closed the door. Ilara did not beg or plead for entry into the community's fold. She kept to herself, a small, quiet presence at the fringe of things. She had a tattered book in her sack, its cover long gone and its pages softened with use. It was a book of old-world engineering and agricultural principles, a relic from a grandfather she barely remembered, a man who had built dikes in a land below the sea. While the other settlers built their cabins tall, reaching for the sky, Ilara spent her days walking the low ground near the creek, studying the contours of the earth, her eyes not on the trees, but on the soil beneath them. One afternoon, as the first hints of the coming cold were beginning to bite, she chose her spot. It was a gentle, south-facing slope, sheltered from the northern winds by a thick stand of pine and a rise in the land. She took a sharp stick and began to draw in the dirt. It was not the familiar square of a cabin footprint. It was a rectangle, long and narrow, and beside it, a smaller, deeper square, connected by a short trench. Silas, the settlement's most respected builder, a man whose dovetailed corners were a point of local pride, happened to be passing by. He stopped, watching her strange work, a frown creasing his weathered face. "What's that you're drawing, girl?" he asked, his voice a low rumble of authority. He was not an unkind man, but he was a man who trusted tradition above all else. He saw progress as the refinement of old ways, not the invention of new ones. Ilara looked up, her expression unreadable. "My home," she said, her voice soft but clear. Silas squinted at the shape in the dirt. He saw a pit, a sunken hole. He saw a design that did not rise from the earth but retreated into it. A flicker of amusement, then disbelief, crossed his face. "That's not a home," he chuckled, the sound sharp in the crisp air. "That's a grave. You plan to bury yourself before the winter does it for you?" His laughter brought others over. They gathered around, looking at the strange girl and her stranger drawing. They saw a child's foolish notion, a plan born of desperation and ignorance. They saw an affront to the way things were done. A home was meant to stand tall, a testament to human strength against the wilderness. It was meant to be made of timber, solid and visible. This idea of digging into the ground felt like a surrender, an animal's retreat into a burrow. It was primitive, undignified. "The ground freezes 3 feet deep," one man warned, shaking his head. "You'll be encased in ice." "And the spring melt?" another added, with a scornful laugh. "You'll drown in your own cellar." "It's a fool's errand," Silas declared, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. "You'll waste your strength digging a hole only to freeze in it. Build with logs, girl. Build proper. It's the only way." Ilara listened to their mockery and their dire warnings. She did not argue. She did not try to explain the principles of thermal mass she had read about in her grandfather's book, the idea that the earth itself, at a certain depth, held a constant, steady temperature, a vast reservoir of coolness in the summer, and, more importantly, of relative warmth in the winter. She could not make them understand that she was not surrendering to the earth, but partnering with it. Their minds were as rigid as the frozen ground they stood upon. So she simply nodded, picked up the worn shovel she had traded for mending clothes, and broke the soil. The laughter followed her as she began to dig, a chorus of doubt that would be her only company for the weeks to come. The work was a relentless, brutal rhythm of motion and will. The topsoil was the first to yield, a dark, rich loam that smelled of decaying leaves and the promise of life. But soon her shovel struck a harder layer of dense, wet clay, and the work slowed to a painful crawl. Each shovelful was a victory hard won against the clinging, heavy earth. She dug from the first light of dawn until her arms trembled with exhaustion, and the purple dusk settled over the valley. The mockery from the settlement faded into a distant memory, replaced by the immediate, overwhelming reality of the labor. Her hands, soft from a life of mending and tending, were soon a raw landscape of blisters that broke, bled, and hardened into thick calluses. Her back screamed in protest each morning when she rose from her simple bed of pine boughs. But she did not stop. She worked with a quiet, methodical diligence that was unnerving to watch. She was not frantic or rushed. She was patient, as if she were not building a shelter against a deadline, but sculpting the earth itself, one careful slice at a time. The hole grew deeper, longer, the pile of excavated dirt beside it rising like a monument to her solitary effort. While she toiled in her pit, the rest of the settlement was a hive of activity, but of a different kind. Silas and his sons were raising a new barn, their axes ringing with a confident, cheerful cadence. The air filled with the clean scent of fresh-cut pine as they notched and fitted the massive logs with practiced efficiency. Their work was swift, impressive, a display of skill and strength. They built upwards, their structure climbing towards the sky, a proud assertion against the wilderness. They finished the barn in a week, a handsome, sturdy building that earned Silas nods of respect from everyone who passed. They were preparing for winter the way they always had, by reinforcing the methods that had, until now, always been enough. They stockpiled wood, mended their tools, and looked at the strange girl digging her hole with a mixture of pity and contempt. Ilara's work was slow because it was precise. Once the main chamber was dug to a depth of 5 feet, she began the painstaking process of lining the earthen walls. She did not have the means to fire bricks or mix mortar. Instead, she used the stones that the valley offered up freely. She spent days walking the creek bed and the surrounding hills, gathering flat, heavy field stones. She carried them one by one back to her site, her small frame straining under their weight. She did not simply stack them. She fitted them together like pieces of a vast, irregular puzzle, finding the right curve, the right angle, to lock each stone against its neighbors. It was a dry stack wall, built with an ancient patience, and as it rose, it transformed the simple hole into a solid, subterranean chamber. The innovation was not just in the digging, but in the design, a system of interlocking principles learned from her grandfather's book. The first was thermal mass, the packed earth behind her stone walls, and the stone walls themselves would absorb and hold heat. Unlike a wooden cabin, which shed its warmth almost as fast as the stove could produce it, her dugout would become a battery of heat, storing the energy from her small fire and radiating it back slowly and evenly. The earth was not her enemy, it was her insulation. The second principle was a defense against the wind. Her roof would not stand tall to be battered by the northern gales. She felled several medium-sized pines, a task that took her days of exhausting work with a small, sharp axe. Using smaller logs as rollers and a long branch as a lever, she painstakingly maneuvered the heavy timbers into place across the top of her stone walls. She laid them close together, then covered them with a thick layer of sod and the clay she had first excavated. By the time she was done, the roof was a living part of the hillside, a thick blanket of earth that the wind would simply flow over, unable to find a purchase. Her greatest ingenuity, however, was in the entrance. The settlers' cabins had doors that opened directly into the living space, and every time they were opened, a tidal wave of frigid air would flood the room, undoing all the hard work of the fire. Ilara's design, based on a diagram in her book, featured a cold trap. She had dug a deeper, smaller pit connected to the main chamber by a short tunnel. The entrance to the outside was a heavy, angled door at the top of this pit. Cold air, being heavier than warm air, would flow down into the trap and settle at the bottom, unable to rise up into the main living space. It was a simple, elegant solution based on a fundamental law of physics, a law that traditional builders had never considered. She built her flue with the same care, using flat stones to create a winding channel through the earthen back wall. This design was less efficient at creating a quick draft, but it was far more effective at capturing the heat of the smoke. The hot gases would have to travel a longer, slower path, their warmth leaching into the stone and earth along the way, turning the entire back wall into a gentle, radiant heater. Her fire would not need to roar. It would only need to smolder, its energy captured and stored, not wasted up a straight chimney into the winter sky. By the time the first snows began to fall in earnest, her work was done. From a distance, her home was nearly invisible, a slight, sod-covered mound on the hillside, with only a squat stone chimney and an angled wooden door to mark its presence. Silas, passing by on his way to check his trap lines, saw her standing beside it. He had to admit, the girl had worked like a demon, but he saw only a hole in the ground, covered with dirt. He shook his head, a genuine sadness in his eyes. "A hard winter's coming, girl," he said, his voice softer now, the mockery replaced by a somber pity. "There's still time to build a proper lean-to. You'll not last a week in that hole." Ilara simply looked at her finished work, at the solid door and the sturdy chimney. "I will be warm," she said, a statement of fact, not of pride. He heard only a child's stubborn foolishness. He sighed and walked on, leaving her to her fate. The great storm did not announce its arrival with a dramatic flourish. It began as a quiet thickening of the air, a lowering of the gray sky, until it seemed to rest directly on the tops of the pine trees. The wind fell away into an unnerving, absolute stillness. The world seemed to be holding its breath. The settlers knew this ominous silence. It was the calm before the assault, the deep inhalation of the beast before it roared. They made their final preparations, bringing in the last of the split wood, securing their livestock, and saying quiet prayers. Then it came. It started not as snow, but as a fine, stinging powder of ice, driven by a wind that rose from a whisper to a shriek in the space of an hour. The temperature plummeted. It was a living, predatory cold that sought out every crack, every weakness, with the intelligence of a hunter. The sky dissolved into a churning, white chaos. Visibility dropped to zero. The world beyond a man's own front door ceased to exist, swallowed by the blizzard. The settlers were now prisoners in the very cabins they had built to protect them. Inside Silas's home, the proudest and best-built cabin in Gray River, the battle was already being lost. The wind, like 1,000 knives, found its way through the chinking he had so carefully applied. It screamed around the window frames and howled down the chimney, driving puffs of smoke back into the room. His wife, Mary, had hung blankets over the walls, but they did little to stop the penetrating chill. Their 2 small children were huddled by the stove, wrapped in every spare piece of cloth they owned, their faces pale and pinched. Silas fed the fire with a grim determination. The stove, which normally consumed a respectable amount of wood, was now a ravenous monster. He stuffed it with split oak and birch, logs that should have burned for hours, but were reduced to ash in what felt like minutes. The heat blasted out in a small 5-foot circle, a temporary oasis in a desert of cold. Beyond that circle, the temperature in the cabin continued to drop. The water bucket in the corner, a full 10 feet from the fire, developed a skin of ice. By the second day, it was frozen solid. Silas looked at his woodpile, stacked neatly inside against the wall. It was meant to last 2 weeks. He knew, with a sinking feeling of dread, that it would be gone in 3 days. He was a master builder, but his craft was useless against this onslaught. His handsome cabin was a sieve, and he was pouring his family's safety into it, only to watch it drain away into the storm. The story was the same across the settlement. The miller's roof, burdened by the immense weight of the snow, began to creak and groan, threatening to collapse. The Jensen boys' cough grew worse, a ragged, painful sound that cut through the noise of the wind. They were all doing the same thing, burning wood at an unsustainable rate, huddling closer to their fires, and watching the frost creep farther and farther into their homes. Their traditional structures, designed for ordinary winters, were being broken by this extraordinary one. Their pride in their work was freezing alongside their hope. Meanwhile, on the sheltered slope of the hill, the storm was an entirely different experience. Inside Ilara's dugout, there was a profound and enveloping silence. The shrieking of the wind was a distant, muted roar, a sound from another world that happened high above her. The thick blanket of earth and sod that formed her roof did not creak or groan. It was an immovable part of the landscape, and the snow that piled upon it only added to its insulating power. The air inside was cool, but it was not cold. It was a steady, even temperature that felt almost impossibly gentle. Her small fire, built in the stone-lined hearth at the back, did not rage. It was a small, calm bed of embers, fed by just a few pieces of wood every few hours. The heat from the fire radiated into the stone flue and the packed earth of the back wall, which in turn radiated a gentle, constant warmth back into the small space. There were no drafts. The air was still and calm. The cold trap at the entrance was doing its job perfectly. The frigid air remained pooled at the bottom of the entry pit, a barrier of its own making. Ilara sat on her simple wooden stool, mending a tear in her tunic by the light of a single tallow lamp. She was not shivering. She was not afraid. She was warm, safe, and secure. The storm that was tearing the world apart outside was, to her, little more than a distant rumor. She had a small store of dried meat and berries, a container of clean water melted from snow, and enough wood to last for a month or more at her current, frugal rate of consumption. She had not built a structure to fight the winter. She had built a space that the winter could not find. Her grandfather's book lay open beside her, its pages filled with diagrams of angles and principles of heat transfer. It was a book of wisdom, and she had trusted it over the laughter of men. And it had worked. The storm raged for 3 days and 3 nights without pause. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind finally died down, leaving behind a world transformed. The snow lay in immense sculpted drifts, burying fences and reaching halfway up the walls of the cabins. A brilliant, merciless sun shone from a crystal blue sky, reflecting off the snow with a blinding glare. But the cold remained, intensified by the stillness. The air was so frigid it felt solid, a physical weight on the land. Inside Silas's cabin, the situation was dire. The last of the indoor woodpile had been burned hours ago. The fire in the stove was dead, and the cold that flooded the room was now absolute and terrifying. His youngest child, a daughter of 4 years, was shivering violently under a pile of blankets, her breath coming in shallow, wheezing gasps. Silas knew, with the certainty of a man facing the end, that she would not survive another day in this cold. He had failed. His pride, his skill, his traditions, they had all been worthless. He was going to lose his family in a house he had built with his own hands. He looked out the frosted window at the silent, white landscape. He thought of the girl, the fool girl, digging her own grave. A desperate, irrational thought took root in his mind. What if she had survived? It was impossible. If his cabin, the best in the settlement, had become a tomb of ice, her hole in the ground must be far worse. But the thought would not leave him. It was the last, desperate gamble of a man with no other options. He had to know. Pulling on his heaviest coat and wrapping his face in wool, he plunged out into the snow. The cold was a physical blow, stealing his breath and burning his lungs. The snow was waist-deep, and each step was a monumental effort. He fought his way across the short distance to the hillside where she had built her strange shelter. He saw the mound, now almost completely buried in a drift, with only the very top of the stone chimney visible, a thin, lazy wisp of smoke curling from it. Smoke. The sight of it sent a jolt through him. It wasn't the thick, panicked plume of a fire being desperately fed. It was a calm, steady breath. He stumbled forward, his hope warring with his disbelief. He found the angled door, almost hidden by snow, and with numb hands he clawed it free and pushed it open. He half fell, half climbed down the short set of earthen steps into the cold trap. The air there was cold, but still. Then he pushed aside the heavy hide that covered the inner doorway and stepped into the main chamber. The warmth hit him first. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overworked stove. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to come from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. It was the kind of warmth that uncoiled the knot of fear in his chest. The air was still and quiet. And then he saw her. Elara was sitting on her stool, calmly grinding grain with a small stone mortar. She looked up at him, her expression not of triumph or surprise, but of simple, calm acknowledgement. The room was bathed in the soft glow of her lamp. It was a scene of impossible peace, a sanctuary carved from the heart of the frozen world. Silas stood there, dripping melted snow onto the packed earth floor, unable to speak. His mind struggled to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he knew to be true. His own home, a monument of log and pride, was an icebox. This burrow, was a haven. The contrast was so stark, so absolute, that it shattered his worldview. The frost on his beard began to melt and drip onto his coat. He looked from the steady, radiant stone wall to the small, calm fire, to the girl who had built it all. He, the master builder, was the fool. She, the outcast child, was the master. "How?" he finally managed to whisper, the word a ragged puff of steam in the warm air. Elara did not smile or boast. She did not say, "I told you so." She simply looked at him with her old, quiet eyes and stated a simple truth. "The earth holds the heat," she said. "The wind cannot take what it cannot find." She gestured to a low bench against the far wall. "Sit. You are cold." He did not need to be told twice. He stumbled to the bench and sat, the gentle warmth seeping into his frozen limbs like a benediction. He looked around the small, 10 by 15-foot space. It was not a grave. It was a womb. It was the safest, warmest place he had ever been in his life. He had laughed at her. He had called her a fool. He was wrong. It was a thought so clear and so powerful that it felt like a physical blow. He was wrong, and his daughter was freezing to death because of it. "My family," he said, his voice cracking. "My little girl. She's sick. The cabin is frozen." Elara's expression did not change, but a new resolve entered her eyes. She stood up, put aside her mortar, and began to bank her fire, covering the embers with ash so they would smolder safely for hours. "Bring them here," she said. It was not a suggestion. It was a quiet command. "There is room." Silas didn't hesitate. He plunged back out into the brutal cold, but this time he moved with a purpose born not of desperation, but of hope. He fought his way back to his cabin. The image of that warm, quiet room burned into his mind. He and Mary wrapped their children in every blanket they had left and carried them, stumbling and struggling through the deep snow, back to the dugout. The news of Silas, the proudest man in Grey River, moving his family into the fool girl's hole in the ground, spread through the settlement with the speed of a winter fire. At first it was met with disbelief, but as the day wore on and the killing cold refused to relent, curiosity overcame skepticism. One by one, then in small groups, the settlers made their way to the hillside. They came to gawk, to whisper, perhaps even to laugh again. But the laughter died in their throats as they stepped inside. Each person who entered had the same reaction. First, a shock as the gentle, pervasive warmth enveloped them. Then, a stunned silence as they took in the scene. The calm fire, the still air, the children of Silas sleeping peacefully under a fur blanket, their breathing easy and regular for the first time in days. They looked at the dry stacked stone walls, the massive roof beams, the ingenious cold trap entrance. They touched the back wall near the flue and felt the impossible steady heat radiating from it. They saw not a primitive burrow, but a design of profound and elegant intelligence. They saw a solution to a problem that was killing them, a solution they had mocked out of pride and ignorance. The dugout, which had been a symbol of Ilara's foolishness, was now a testament to her wisdom. And they, the hardy, experienced settlers, were the fools. The realization settled upon them, as heavy and as cold as the snow outside. The storm finally broke completely a day later. As the families returned to their own frozen cabins to assess the damage and count their losses, 2 had lost precious livestock, and nearly everyone was dangerously low on wood. A new mood had taken hold of the settlement. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, humbled respect. They looked at their own tall, cold homes with new eyes, seeing not symbols of strength, but monuments to a flawed tradition. A few days later, Silas returned to the dugout. He did not come to offer thanks, though the gratitude was etched on every line of his face. He came with a flat, smooth piece of poplar bark and a lump of charcoal held in his calloused hands. He found Ilara outside, splitting a small log with precise, economical swings of her axe. He stood before her, the master builder before the child, and held out the bark and charcoal. "Teach me," he said, his voice stripped of all its former pride. "Show me how you did it. Show us all." Ilara stopped her work. She looked at the man, at the offering in his hands, and saw the genuine hunger for knowledge in his eyes. She took the piece of bark and the charcoal without a word. She knelt in the snow and began to draw, just as she had done in the dirt all those months ago. But this time, she was not alone. Silas knelt beside her, and soon others from the settlement gathered around, their faces serious and attentive. They did not laugh. They listened. She explained the principles from her grandfather's book in simple, direct terms. She spoke of the earth as a blanket, not an enemy. She explained how the cold trap worked, how the long, winding flue captured the escaping heat, how the sod roof used the weight of the snow as even more insulation. She answered their questions patiently, sharing her knowledge as freely as the valley shared its stone and timber. She held nothing back. There was no triumph in her voice, only the quiet satisfaction of a truth being understood. She was not a victor claiming spoils. She was a teacher sharing a vital lesson. That spring, a new sound was heard in the Gray River Valley. It was not the ring of axes felling trees for another tall cabin. It was the scrape and thud of shovels digging into the earth. Led by Silas, the settlers began to build anew. They chose south-facing slopes, and they dug. They laid foundations of dry stacked stone and built low, earth-sheltered homes with living roofs and cold trap entrances. The landscape of the settlement began to change, sinking into the embrace of the land itself. The new homes were not as handsome or as imposing as the old log cabins, but they were warm. They were efficient. They consumed a fraction of the wood and held a steady, comfortable temperature through the harshest cold snaps. The following winter, there was no panic, no frantic chopping, no children shivering with coughs. There was peace. There was security. There was a quiet gratitude for the girl who had taught them how to survive. The story of the Gray River settlement and its strange, sunken homes spread slowly. A traveling surveyor, mapping the territory, was astonished to find the community thriving and comfortable during a brutal cold spell. He stayed for a week, sketching the designs of the dugouts and taking copious notes as Silas, now Ilara's most devoted student, explained the principles with the zeal of a convert. The surveyor's report, published in a gazette back east, told the tale of an outcast girl who had saved a town by teaching them to build like badgers. The idea traveled, carried by word of mouth and by the quiet evidence of its own success. Other settlements, plagued by the same harsh winters, began to experiment with earth-sheltered designs. The Grey River method became a byword for practical, life-saving ingenuity. Ilara never sought credit or fame. She remained in her small dugout on the hillside, a quiet, respected figure in the community that had once scorned her. She had not sought to lead or to revolutionize. She had only sought to live. But in doing so, she had given them all a new lease on life. Years later, when Silas was an old man with grandchildren playing in the warm, safe homes he had helped build, he would often look up at the slight mound on the hillside. He would tell the children the story of the great storm of '78, and of the young girl who had faced their laughter with quiet diligence. The lesson he taught them was not just about how to build a house. It was a lesson in humility. It was about the danger of pride and the wisdom in listening to a quiet voice, no matter how small or strange it may seem. The greatest strength, he would say, was not in standing tall against the storm, but in having the wisdom to bend with the earth and the humility to learn from those you once thought foolish. It was a lesson that the Grey River settlement, born again from the cold, never forgot.